It was a Sunday, just 2 weeks after the funeral. The living room still smelled like cinnamon and the faint scent of my husband's aftershave lingering on his favourite chair. My son, Michael, had invited everyone over. Just a casual lunch, he said. I knew what that meant. The kind of casual that comes with whispered opinions and tight smiles. Rachel, his wife, stood near the fireplace, looking around like she was already measuring the drapes. I sat there quietly, clutching the mug of tea she'd handed me, too sweet, too hot, and not at all how I liked it. The conversation swirled around me. Have you seen the new senior condos on Maple? They're really well designed. No stairs. You'd love that. And then Rachel leaned in, voice light, like she was offering a gift. It might be time to start thinking about next steps, something easier, smaller. You've had a beautiful life here, Linda. But this house, it's too much now. I blinked. Just once. Did they practice that line? My fingers tightened around the mug. The garden outside, my garden, looked so still. My husband and I had laid every stone in that path. He built the bench. He planted the lilacs because I liked how they smelled at dusk. They talked like I was already gone. I didn't argue. I just nodded like someone who hadn't fully woken up yet. Michael didn't say a word. He just kept swirling the ice in his glass, not meeting my eyes. This house. It's too much now. That sentence wouldn't stop echoing. Too much for who? For me? Or for them? Rachel smiled again. The kind of smile you'd use to ease a child into handing over their favourite toy. Just as something to think about, she added, setting a real estate flyer on the table like it was an hors d'oeuvre. I reached for it, just to be polite, but my fingers didn't close around it. I couldn't. No one noticed. They moved on, laughing, talking about holiday plans, about renovations, about future guests, and I sat there in the house I helped build with the man I buried. No one asked if I was ready to let go. They just assumed I already had, but I hadn't. I still woke up every morning and listened for the creak in the hallway, the one he always triggered first. I still left his slippers by the bed. I still touched the edge of the brass key we used to keep in the drawer, the one with a ribbon he tied on it years ago. They were planning a future I wasn't part of. But this house still remembered me. The knock on the door was soft, apologetic almost, but when I opened it, I didn't find my son. I found Rachel's friend, Julie, the one who always wore too much perfume and spoke in suggestions that felt more like instructions. She smiled like we were old friends. Hi, Linda. Rachel thought you might want to step outside for a bit. The weather's lovely, and the agent just arrived. Agent? I stepped onto the porch, and there he was, tall, young, clipboard in hand. He was already walking the perimeter, jotting things down like he owned it. Great curb appeal, he said without looking at me. Curb appeal. Rachel stood in the driveway, arms crossed, talking to him like it was already her property. They didn't see me, or maybe they did, but thought I wouldn't understand. She says the foundation's solid, I heard Rachel say, but we can probably flip it quickly if we don't overprice. My ears rang. Flip it. My husband didn't build a project, he built a home. He carried every beam. He sketched the back porch himself because I said I liked how the light hit in the evenings. And now they were talking about it like it was a number on a spreadsheet. I didn't step forward. I didn't interrupt. I just turned and looked back at the house. My house. I could still see the blue chalk line on the driveway from when Michael drew his first hopscotch. The spot under the porch where we'd buried our old dog. The wind chimes he hung when I was sick because he said the sound helped him believe things would pass. Rachel turned toward me then, almost surprised to see me standing there. Oh, you're up, she said cheerily. We just wanted to get a head start. The market's really hot right now. A head start on what? losing the last piece of him. I smiled faintly, just enough to hide the break in my voice. Of course, I said. Good to plan ahead. And then I walked back inside, past the hallway he painted in honeycream, into the kitchen he built with hands that always smelled like cedar and coffee. The chair by the window creaked as I sat down. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just stared out at the garden we built together. He used to joke that the lilacs bloomed better when I was angry, so he tried not to upset me in spring. They bloomed early this year. Her little feet made almost no sound on the kitchen tile. I didn't even notice Lily had walked in until I saw her reflection in the glass of the patio door, holding something between her fingers. She was barefoot, her hair still mussed from napping on the couch, and her dress had a faint smudge of chocolate ice cream from earlier. "Grandma," she said softly, "are they taking your flowers too?" I turned slowly. She stood there with one of the lilac blossoms cradled in her palm, like it might float away. "I picked this one," she added, "but I didn't know if it was still yours." Her voice didn't crack. Mine nearly did. I crouched down and touched her hand. The petal was still damp with dew. "No one can take flowers from someone who loves them," I said, trying to keep my smile still. She nodded slowly, like she was writing it into her mind as a rule. "But Daddy said we might live here, and Mommy said it's not polite to pick things from someone else's house." That last line cut in ways she didn't understand. I brushed a bit of leaf from her cheek. "This garden remembers you, sweetheart. It remembers everyone who loved it." She smiled wide, innocent and satisfied with that answer. Then she held out the lilac. "You can keep this one, Grandma." I took it like it was glass, and, for a moment, I just stared out the window again, holding the flower like a flag no one else could see. This house had held every version of me: young wife, new mother, tired caretaker, grieving widow, and now it was trying to hold on to the grandmother too. But they were already pulling it away by the corners, like unravelling a quilt. Lily climbed up onto the bench beside me and swung her legs. "Is Grandpa in the garden too?" I didn't speak for a second. Then I whispered, "He's in everything that grows here." She nodded, satisfied again, and rested her head on my arm. We stayed like that until I heard a soft rustle behind me. Michael. He stood just outside the kitchen, not speaking. I wondered how long he had been listening. He looked tired, older than his age, and when our eyes met, he glanced down, then away. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. His voice wasn't firm. It wasn't cold. It was rehearsed. I rose slowly and nodded, leaving the lilac on the windowsill. The back porch still had the chipped corner he never finished painting. Michael sat on the steps like he used to when he was 16, hunched over, palms against his knees. I sat beside him, letting the silence press first. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't know Rachel had already scheduled the agent," he muttered. That was his opening line. Not sorry, not explanation, just a subtle shift of blame. "But you didn't stop her," I said softly. He winced. "Mum?" He looked out at the lawn. "This place, it's a lot. It's old, big. Heating's expensive. You're alone. And I'm not a burden," I interrupted. He froze, then slowly turned to me. "Number? That's not what I'm saying. It's not you. It's everything around you. Dad never updated the title. Legally, the house is in limbo." I didn't respond. I had suspected something was off. My husband always promised, "I'll fix the paperwork later." Later never came. Michael continued quietly. "Rachel thinks it's best to simplify. Sell it, invest. Use it to help you settle somewhere smaller. Safe. Safe." I almost laughed. "She wants to help me by erasing everything that reminds me of him. She thinks it's practical," he said, choosing each word like stepping stones across ice. "She's not trying to hurt you." I let that settle. "She doesn't love this place," I said. He hesitated. No, he admitted. She never did. It creaks, it's drafty, and it reminds her of how quiet things get between us when we visit. That last line wasn't for me. It slipped out. One of those things you say when your mind forgets to lie. She's not wrong about the upkeep, I said finally, but this house is not just drywall and taxes. It's where I was still someone's wife, still someone's home. Michael's face softened. I know, he whispered. We sat like that a while, two people with the same blood, speaking different griefs. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I found this, he said. It's a copy of Dad's old draft deed. There's a note scribbled on the back. It's faint, but it looks like his writing. My fingers trembled as I took it. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I said, She's trying to do what she thinks is right, but you know what's true. He looked at me, then, really looked. I don't want to be in the middle. You already are, I said gently. The question is which side you'll remember standing on. The house always felt different at night, not lonely, just deeper, as if every wall could finally breathe, no longer trying to impress company or host a smile. That night, I sat at the kitchen table alone. The folded paper Michael gave me lay in front of me, untouched. The house creaked the way it always had. Soft steps on the stairwell I used to mistake for his when he came home late. The wind chime outside the porch door tapped just once. I unfolded the paper slowly. It was a draft copy of the deed, all right, from over a decade ago. The ink had faded in places, and my husband's signature wasn't on it, but on the back. A short line, written sideways, like he'd jotted it during a phone call. If anything happens to me, this house stays with Linda. No signature, no date, just his handwriting. But I knew it. I'd seen it on birthday cards, grocery lists, little notes he used to leave in my coat pocket. There was no mistaking it. And yet, it wasn't legal. It wasn't enough. I held the paper in my hands like it might still carry his warmth. Something stung behind my eyes, but I blinked it back. I stood and walked slowly toward the hallway, toward his study. He hadn't used it much in his final months, but I hadn't touched anything. The chair still bore the imprint of his last evening there. The lamp was still tilted, just slightly, the way he liked. I opened the bottom drawer. The one he always said held the important things, receipts, notebooks, a box of old business cards, and beneath it all, our brass key, still tied with the same faded blue ribbon he'd used to mark it. He once told me, "This key opens what no one else knows about." I thought it was a joke. I picked it up now, letting the metal press into my palm. There was no magic in it, but there was weight. Literal and emotional. I sat in his chair and let the quiet press against me. Not a single person in this house, not Rachel, not Michael, would ever know what it felt like to sit in this exact spot and miss someone so deeply that even their handwriting felt like a ghost touch. I held the paper again and whispered, not to the air but to him. You knew, didn't you? You just didn't get the chance. Just past the filing cabinet was a small door. The knob was stiff, and the frame still bore the faint outline of the sticker he'd peeled off years ago, some brand he didn't like. It led into what he always called the sunroom, though no one else really used that word anymore. I pushed it open. The smell hit me first. Cedar shavings, old leather, a whisper of turpentine. The window was cracked open just enough to let in the late afternoon breeze, and the dust in the air danced like memory. He built this room himself when Michael was a teenager, said every man needed a corner of the world where his thoughts could land. The drafting table was still angled just so. His tools, meticulously arranged. Sketchbooks lined the shelf beside small boxes labelled in his handwriting. I stepped inside, careful not to disturb anything, and walked toward the table. His garden sketches were there, layered like onion skin, delicate with aging edges. I recognized one immediately, a design for the lilac bed, drawn after I told him I hated how the last batch crowded the back steps. He'd written at the bottom, in pencil, "Linda wants space to breathe." I ran my fingers along the faded lines. This wasn't just his room, it was a place where he remembered me in everything. In the corner, an old lockbox rested on a shelf, half hidden behind paint samples and a cracked mason jar. Without thinking, I reached for the brass key in my pocket. It slid in effortlessly, a soft click. A drawer I didn't even know existed pulled open inside the cabinet beneath the table. Inside, one leather-bound sketchbook, a metal tape measure, and a small cloth pouch tied with twine. I lifted the pouch. It was heavy. Inside were 2 rings, his wedding band and mine. I hadn't even realised mine had gone missing. I must have taken it off when I was cooking that week, left it in the soap dish, but he had tucked them away, together. There was no note, no label, just the rings, tied in fabric like something sacred. My throat tightened. I wasn't ready for that kind of message, but I heard it all the same. That even in his last days, he still kept us close, deliberately, gently, without drama. And maybe he had left more than one message behind. I sat back down at the kitchen table, the sketchbook still in my hands. It was thicker than the others, older, its edges curled like it had been thumbed through 100 times and never closed properly. The leather cover still smelled faintly of pine, his scent, and the stitching along the spine had begun to fray. I opened to the first page. Nothing but pencil marks and light garden layouts. Then page after page of sketches, some full, some just notes in the margins. North wall too damp. Add stepstones for Linda. No begonias, too fussy. Each one a timestamp of conversations we'd forgotten we had. And then, halfway through the book, tucked loosely between 2 pages, a folded sheet. The paper was soft with age, its corners worn like fabric. I unfolded it gently, not expecting anything more than measurements. But there it was. When the world feels like it's shifting without warning. The words trailed off, then continued, in a second, more elegant hand. "Remember who you built it with." My breath caught. The first half, his writing. The second, mine. I had written that part. I remember now. It was years ago, maybe during one of our last garden redesigns when I teased him about being too stubborn to let the landscaper help. We had laughed. I'd written it as a joke. He had saved it. 2 sentences, 2 voices, 1 page. When the world feels like it's shifting without warning, remember who you built it with. I read it again. It wasn't legal. It wasn't binding, but it was everything. I smoothed the page flat on the table and gently traced both lines with my fingertip, like I was remembering the touch of both our hands writing them. In that moment, it didn't feel like I was alone anymore. He had tucked reminders everywhere, not loud or grand, but soft, almost like breadcrumbs for when I'd feel lost, a whisper between the lines. I looked at the rings again, still sitting in their cloth pouch beside me, and then back at the sketchbook. He knew, even if he never said it outright, he knew this fight would come. And he gave me what he could, clarity. A trace of his voice, mingled with mine. The next morning, I stepped outside to get the newspaper, a habit I never quite gave up, even though I mostly read on my phone now. The air was sharp, but the garden was calm. The lilacs had begun to open wide. They always did that when it was just cold enough to make you question spring. As I bent to pick up the paper, I heard a voice from across the hedge. "Morning, Linda," my neighbour Marion called. She was still in her robe, coffee mug in hand, dog leash dangling from one wrist like a forgotten accessory. I smiled politely. "Morning?" She didn't smile back. Just gave me that look older women give when they know something you wish they didn't. "I heard there was a showing yesterday," she said, too casually. "Busy time for the market, huh?" I froze for half a second, then folded the paper tightly. "It was more of an appraisal," I replied evenly. "Just early steps." Marion nodded, sipping her coffee, and then she tilted her head. "You've had a good run here," she said. "But it makes sense. The house is a lot, and younger couples are always looking for a project with charm." I knew that tone, the one that sounded like support, but landed like exile, charm, history, code words for ready to be passed on. I didn't answer. I just offered a nod and turned to go back inside. But before I stepped in, she added, "Don't wait too long, dear. The best listings come from people who choose to leave, not the ones who get pushed." My fingers tightened on the doorknob. She meant well. I knew she did. But her words still cut. In her eyes, I was no longer the woman who built this place with her husband. I was the aging widow, still occupying a house that could be better used. Inside, I dropped the newspaper on the table and stared out at the porch. That had once been the place where neighbours came to share iced tea, where children had run barefoot, where my husband had sat reading the paper with his feet up on the rail. Now, it felt like a stage, a place others looked at, waiting for me to step off so someone younger could step in. Was this how legacy disappeared? Not through malice, but through quiet replacement? I turned and walked to the study. If people were talking, if my time here was already being rewritten, I needed to make sure my husband's intentions weren't. I reached for the deed draft and the envelope we hadn't fully opened yet. The envelope had been sitting on the corner of the desk since Michael handed it to me. I'd opened it, skimmed it, folded it again, but something about Marion's voice that morning, so certain, so final, had shaken something loose in me. I returned to the study and laid the envelope flat. My fingers, still slightly cold from the morning breeze, pulled the papers out carefully this time. The draft deed was there, same as before, but now I noticed something tucked behind it, nearly invisible, a thinner page, folded once, wedged into the envelope lining. I slid it out gently. It looked like an old calendar printout. Not a full calendar, just a single date, typed in small font, highlighted faintly in yellow. Petition deadline, May 15th, deed confirmation or inheritance reversion. May 15th. I checked the wall calendar by the fridge. 3 days. 3 days before whatever claim I had, whatever shadow of my husband's promise remained, would revert. Likely to the person who filed the preliminary claim, Rachel. My hands began to tremble. Why didn't Michael mention this? Did he even know? And then I saw the final blow. Underneath the clause, in the smallest fine print, a line read, "No secondary beneficiary listed. Name, Rachel M. Langford." Not even Michael, not me, just her. I sat down slowly, the draft deed falling from my hands like it had burned me. My husband had tried. He'd left messages, notes, symbols, even the truth in scattered sketches. But legally, I had nothing. And in 3 days, even the whispers of his intention would no longer matter. I stood and walked to the kitchen, trying to breathe. It felt like I'd just been erased, like my name had been wiped from the blueprint of the very place I helped build. The fridge hummed, the chime on the back door twinkled once. It was the sound of life going on. I pulled open the drawer by the sink and took out my old address book, the one with curled corners and a faded sticker of a butterfly on the cover. Inside, I flipped to L. Langston, David, family law. He was an old friend of my husband's, quiet, meticulous, the kind of man who read every word on a page twice. If there was anyone left who might help me find a legal voice in this, it was him. David answered on the second ring. "Linda," he said warmly, though his voice was tinged with surprise. "It's been a while." I skipped the pleasantries. "I found a petition deadline," I said, already out of breath. "May 15th. I have 3 days." He paused. Then, "What did Michael give you?" I explained. The draft, the scribbled note from my husband, the folded calendar slip. He sighed. "I remember that draft. Your husband brought it to me months before he passed. We talked through options. He wasn't ready to sign because he wanted to update the will first, remember?" I did remember. Sort of. It was a chaotic time. "He left the documents here," David continued. "I held on to them while he worked on the new language. My pulse was climbing. So, why is Rachel's name the only one listed?" Another pause. But this time it was heavier. "She stopped by," David said quietly. "About 2 weeks before your husband passed." I blinked. "Rachel." She said he was too weak to manage the legal side, and she offered to pick up the draft to speed things along and simplify matters for the family. The silence between us expanded like a crack in ice. "I assumed she had your husband's blessing. She showed me a note, typed, not signed, and you let her take the file." "She was insistent," he admitted. "She said she'd make sure it got signed, witnessed, returned, but I never saw it again." I pressed my fingers to my temple. The sketchbook, the missing page, the letter never mailed. "She took it," I whispered. "She took everything before he could finish." David sounded wounded. "I should have double-checked." "But you didn't," I replied, not unkindly. "You trusted her." We both knew what that meant now. Rachel hadn't just acted early. She'd intercepted everything before it could protect me. I walked to the drawer where I'd placed the sketchbook and opened it again. The note we'd written together was still there, but suddenly it felt fragile. Not like comfort, but evidence. "She buried my name," I whispered. David's voice softened. "Linda, if there's anything irregular in how she filed or obtained those papers, it's not over." I nodded slowly. "Then we fight." I set the table myself. No takeout boxes, no paper plates. Real dishes, silver cutlery, cloth napkins folded like we used to when Michael was still in high school, and we had Sunday roast if they were going to stand in my home and talk about its sale. They'd do it while looking at what it meant. The doorbell rang, right on time. Michael and Rachel entered, followed by Emily, Rachel's cousin, a real estate agent who suddenly appeared at every family dinner lately, and little Nora, their daughter. Rachel wore that practiced smile of hers, the one that always looked good in pictures but never quite reached her eyes. "Mom." Michael said softly, "Thanks for dinner." I smiled. "Of course." They stepped into the dining room. Rachel moved toward the seat my husband used to occupy. "No," I said gently, placing my hand on the chair. "This one stays empty tonight." She hesitated, then offered a tight nod and chose another seat. The others settled around the table. Emily chatted about school districts. Nora picked at the edge of her cloth napkin. I served the stew silently, moving around the table with the same rhythm I had for years. But everything felt different, colder. "Smells amazing," Rachel said. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "Of course I did," I replied, taking my seat. "This may be the last meal I serve in this house." The silence that followed was only 2 seconds long, but it landed like thunder. Michael looked down. Rachel cleared her throat. "Well, there's something we've been meaning to discuss, and now might be a good time." "We'll get to that," I said calmly. She blinked. Emily reached for the salad. Awkwardly, I looked around the table at each of them, This room had once held birthdays, Christmases, and long, quiet evenings where no one needed to speak to feel full. Now, it felt like a courtroom, except no one was brave enough to admit the verdict had already been written behind my back. I noticed Michael's wedding ring twisting slightly on his finger. He always did that when he was nervous. Rachel sat straight, napkin perfectly folded in her lap. But her eyes kept glancing at the folder in her bag. I took a slow sip of water. I may not have the deed, but I still own the story of this house, and before they rewrote it with signatures and sale papers, I would leave behind a chapter they couldn't erase. Rachel placed her fork down with exaggerated care, as if what she was about to say required surgical precision. "I know this isn't easy," she began, reaching into her tote bag, "but this house, it's not sustainable." She slid a slim manila folder onto the table and opened it, revealing printed pages, listings, appraisal reports, even a timeline labelled "Projected Market Window." My stomach turned, but I didn't speak. Rachel went on. "It's a lovely home, Linda, but it's too much for one person. You said so yourself, remember? After Harold passed. You said the upstairs hadn't been touched in months." I held her gaze. "I said I didn't go up there," I replied. "I never said it was too much." Rachel offered a neutral smile, the kind that says we'll pretend you didn't say that. Michael looked down again. Still silent, Rachel exhaled slowly. "Look, I didn't grow up with much. My mum moved us around constantly. 6 apartments by the time I was 15. You know how many Thanksgivings I ate on a coffee table?" I didn't answer. "This house," she continued, "this was the first place I ever felt rooted, where I imagined my own children running through a backyard that didn't back into a parking lot." Her voice softened slightly. "I wanted to give Nora what I never had, stability, a home." She looked at Michael. "She deserves to grow up somewhere that's hers, somewhere safe." I saw it then, not just calculation, but longing. The ache of someone who had built their sense of safety around control and saw me as the one thing standing in the way of that. "And Harold," she added, "he told me once that he didn't want the house to turn into a burden. That he worried about you being here alone." That line, delivered so cleanly, landed like a crack across the table. Michael stirred. "He said that?" he asked quietly. Rachel nodded. "When you were at the hospital one evening, he told me he didn't want her tied to the house like an anchor. That never happened. I knew it didn't. My husband never would have used that word." But the room stayed quiet. Rachel tapped the folder again. "The market's strong now. If we wait too long, the value drops. This isn't about stealing anything from you, Linda. It's about making sure the next generation has a real start." Michael rubbed his temple, then finally looked at me, but his eyes held doubt, like the words were getting to him. Rachel leaned back, and in that moment I saw her clearly, not just as my daughter-in-law, but as a woman who never felt truly home, trying to claim someone else's as her own. The napkin was soft in my hands. I folded it once, then again, just like Harold used to after dinner, neat corners and one hand resting on the edge of his plate. No one spoke. Rachel's folder lay open, but suddenly looked more like a barrier than a plan. Michael's eyes flicked between the paper and me. Nora swung her legs quietly under the table, sensing something even if she didn't understand. I placed the napkin gently on the table and looked at them all. "When Harold and I first moved in," I began, "we had nothing but a mattress on the floors and one skillet." Rachel blinked, unsure where I was going. "We didn't even have real curtains, just 2 old sheets clipped to the window with clothespins." Emily gave a polite laugh. I didn't smile. And one night, after we finished eating beans out of that skillet, Harold looked at me and said— I paused. My voice stayed soft. If the walls remember us, then we belong here. Silence. Complete. Even Nora stopped swinging her feet. Rachel's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Michael leaned forward slightly. He said that. He asked, voice caught somewhere between surprise and regret. I nodded. And every year since, we built a little more into these walls. Not just furniture, not just paint or bricks, but memory. I turned my eyes to Rachel. I know you didn't have that growing up, and I understand why this place feels like safety to you, but this home, this legacy, wasn't built in your name. She started to respond, but I raised a hand gently. Number, just listen. I tapped the wood under my hand. These floors held first steps. These stairs, arguments and reconciliations. That garden, I pointed through the window, was where Harold told me about your engagement. I took a breath. This isn't about market windows or appraisal values. It's about truth. And the truth is, if these walls remember us, then I still belong here. Rachel's face shifted, less cold, more uncertain. Emily looked down, avoiding eye contact entirely. And Michael? He looked at the empty chair, the one I hadn't let anyone sit in. Then he looked at me, and something inside his face changed, a quiet undoing, a seed of doubt now growing into something more. The kitchen was quiet. Dinner was over, plates cleared, coats being grabbed at the front. But Michael stayed behind. He leaned against the counter, back to the sink, arms folded. The light from the stovetop cast a soft glow against the tile, illuminating the old coffee mug I'd left drying by the sink. Harold's mug, still chipped along the rim. I didn't speak first. He did. Did Dad really say that? He asked quietly. About the walls? I nodded. Many times. Michael's lips pressed together. He stared at the counter, then slowly dragged his palm across its surface. Absent-minded. It was something he used to do as a boy, when he had trouble finding the words. Just run his hand over the laminate while thinking hard. I waited. She didn't tell me about the petition, he said at last. My breath caught. What? Michael shook his head. Rachel. She said we needed to move fast, that the papers were just a formality. She never said there was a deadline, or that your name wasn't listed. He didn't look at me. I wouldn't have agreed if I'd known. There it was, the first crack in the wall they'd built together. She told me Dad had already worked it out with her, he continued. Said it was all just about keeping the taxes low and avoiding probate. I walked over slowly, placing a hand on the back of the chair. You trusted her. He nodded. I thought I was doing the right thing for Nora. I looked at him, this man I'd raised, this man who once fell asleep on this very kitchen floor after losing his first soccer match, now unsure of the woman he married. Do you think your father would have signed away the house without telling me? Michael finally met my eyes. No, he whispered. No, I don't. Outside the kitchen, Rachel's voice called faintly. Michael, we should go. He didn't move. His eyes lingered on Harold's mug, on the faded outline of the family photo still stuck to the fridge, then back to me. I didn't know, he said again. This time, softer, almost like an apology. The sound of shoes tapping against tile echoed down the hall. Rachel stood near the front door, purse slung over one shoulder, jacket folded over her arm. Her expression was back to what I recognized, composed, polite, purposeful. But then something small broke the rhythm. Nora reached up toward the wooden shelf just inside the hallway. Balanced on it, right at a child's eye level, was a photo of Harold and me from the early 90s, 4th of July, faded from sunlight. He had his arm around me, and we were both laughing. Who's that? Nora asked, pointing. Rachel turned to her. That's Grandpa Harold and Grandma, she said softly. She reached out with her free hand, then paused. Her fingers hovered just above the frame, almost touching the glass, but stopped short. It was such a small movement, but unmistakable. She stared at the photo for a second longer than necessary, and in that quiet second, something shifted. Not an apology, not a change of heart, but a flicker, a break in the rhythm of certainty, as if even she didn't quite believe her own story anymore. Nora looked up at her mother, watching the hesitation. Then, in an innocent mimicry only children possess, she mirrored it, reaching out toward the photo and stopping just shy of touching it, her small finger resting in the air, and Rachel blinked, noticing it. She turned to the door quickly. "Time to go," she said, voice a little too clipped. Michael walked out from the kitchen then, eyes slightly red. He hadn't cried, but I knew that look. The heaviness behind the eyes when something internal refuses to settle. Rachel adjusted her bag and opened the door, but just before she stepped out, she turned halfway toward me. Her mouth opened for a second, like she might say something, and then she didn't. She gave a slight nod instead. Not curt, not warm, just there, a thread, unfinished. Then she stepped into the night, holding Nora's hand. I stayed by the hallway archway, watching the door close. I didn't feel victorious or vindicated, only quiet, and maybe that was the most honest place I'd stood all evening. The door clicked shut with a finality I hadn't expected. The hallway lights dimmed to a hush. Just me and the hum of the refrigerator. I walked back to the dining table to gather the dishes, but paused when I saw Rachel's folder, still there, opened, slightly askew. At first I thought it was just papers, but something inside the front flap peeked out, smaller, thicker, a folded sketch. I slipped it free and opened it. It was Harold's. I recognised the pencil marks instantly. He'd sketched the living room, just rough lines, loose angles, but it was unmistakable. And in the centre, beneath the fireplace mantel, 2 names were written in his clean block handwriting, L+H. No dates, no flourish, just us. I sat down, the paper in my hand, and let the silence settle around me. They were trying to erase me. Not out of cruelty, perhaps, but out of practicality, out of ambition. But in his quiet way, Harold had drawn me back into the centre, even in graphite, even in a draft. I laid the paper flat and traced the curve of the L. Then I whispered, only for myself, if the walls remember us, then we belong here. I closed my eyes, not to cry, not anymore, just to sit with it, with the space, with the truth. Rachel hadn't won, Michael hadn't lost, and I hadn't been erased. Not from this home, not from this family, not from Harold's story. The folder could go, the listings could expire, the deadlines could pass, but this sketch, this single slip of graphite and memory, was mine. I stood up again and placed the sketch inside my recipe book, between pages stained with years of cinnamon and tomato sauce. It would be safe there, as would I. The morning light crept across the kitchen floor like it always did. But today, I noticed it. Not because I was searching for signs, but because I wasn't. I stood barefoot on the cold tile, the same robe wrapped around me that Harold used to call my early general's coat. The coffee was brewing, slow and steady. The good kind, the kind he liked, not the instant Rachel always brought. I pulled out my favourite mug, the one with the chipped handle and faded red cardinal, and I sat, at the kitchen table, alone, but not lonely. The recipe book sat on the far edge of the table, still cracked slightly open where I'd hidden the sketch. I didn't reach for it. I didn't need to. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was defending something, just inhabiting it. The quiet wasn't sharp anymore. It was soft, like the house had exhaled with me. Outside, I heard the faint chatter of kids riding past on bikes. One called out, "Wait up!" Another laughed. I smiled without meaning to. Life was still moving. I didn't need to fight to keep up with it. Just be still enough to remember I was still part of it. My phone buzzed from the counter. A message from Emily. Michael wants to come by. Just him, okay? I didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, I took a slow sip of coffee. It was bitter and perfect. My eyes drifted toward the back garden. The rosemary bush Harold had planted was still hanging on, overgrown but stubborn, like me. I stood and walked to the back door, opening it just enough to let the morning in. The air was cool, but not cold, a gentle kind of reminder that, even after all the noise, stillness could return, that love could remain even if voices left, and that houses, real homes, remembered us, even if others forgot. The market was quiet for a Saturday. I only needed apples and a loaf of sourdough, but I walked the long way around, through the coffee aisle, past the end caps filled with school supplies no one had touched. The stillness inside me felt different than yesterday's silence. It wasn't from grief. It was from knowing I no longer had to prove anything to anyone. As I rounded the corner into produce, I heard them. 2 women, maybe in their late 30s, chatting by the pairs. She's still hanging on to that old place, one said. You'd think by now she'd want something newer, easier. The other laughed softly. Some people don't stay for convenience. They stay because the walls know their stories. I stopped mid-step. It wasn't even said dramatically, just casual, between fruit and coupons. But the sentence hit my chest like wind through an open window. The walls know their stories. A softer mirror to Harold's words, a stranger's voice echoing the one I'd carried alone. They moved on. I didn't. I stood there for a moment longer, letting the air shift around me. The apple in my hand suddenly felt heavier, not from weight, but meaning. Because this wasn't just about my home. It was about the way memory lives in wood, in tiles, in shadows of door frames worn from decades of footsteps. Rachel didn't understand that. Maybe she never would, but someone out there did. Even if they didn't know they were speaking for me, even if they were just choosing pairs. I paid at the register quietly. The clerk asked if I needed a bag. I said yes, even though I didn't. As I stepped outside, the sun hit the pavement just right, like the house that morning, like a reminder that I wasn't wrong to hold on, that homes didn't have to be defended with paperwork or lawyers. Sometimes they defended you with memory, with truth, with walls that still whispered your name, even if no one else did. The light had shifted by late afternoon, spilling long across the floorboards, just like it used to when Harold would nap on the couch after lunch. I sat at the same table from that night. Same chair, same corner, but everything inside me had rearranged. This time I didn't sit to argue or defend, I sat to write. The journal was old, leather-bound, with a worn, elastic loop I hadn't used in years. I opened it, somewhere near the middle, past grocery lists, phone numbers I no longer recognised, birthday notes from when Michael was a boy, and I wrote, "Some people don't stay for convenience. They stay because the walls know their stories." I paused, then under it, slowly, in all caps, "If the walls remember us, then we belong here." It felt less like a quote now, and more like a truth I had earned. I reached into the recipe book and took out the sketch Harold had made. Gently, I slid it between the pages of the journal. Then I added a photo, one Emily had printed for me last spring. It was Nora, sitting on the front steps, clutching a dandelion, eyes squinting into the sun. I smiled. Not everything was broken. Not every line of memory had been erased. Some had just shifted, waiting to be redrawn. I closed the journal and tied the loop shut, placing it on the shelf beside the cookbooks, the place Harold always reached for when he forgot the recipe for meatloaf, but never wanted to admit it. As I stood, the light caught the edge of a brass knob in the hallway, the closet near the front, where we used to keep board games and blankets. I walked over and opened it. Inside, everything was still there, unmoved. I reached up to the top shelf and pulled down an old shoebox labelled Lake House. Inside, a set of keys, 2 postcards and a sealed envelope addressed in Harold's handwriting. I froze. I had never seen this, not until now. I didn't open it yet, not because I wasn't ready, but because, for the first time in months, I knew it would wait for me. I waited until morning. The sun came slower than usual, soft and gold, like it was afraid to wake the world too quickly. The envelope sat on the table, unopened, still sealed with Harold's steady hand. I made a cup of tea, sat down with my cardigan pulled close, and opened it without ceremony. His handwriting hadn't changed in decades. Straight lines, no flourishes, just like him. Linda, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. But I trust that if the world tried to forget you, this house would not. I made arrangements you don't know about, quiet ones. You always hated paperwork. The house is yours, fully. The papers are with Thompson at the lake house. You always loved it there more than I did. Take the key. Go when you're ready. And if the walls remember us, then so will you. Yours, H. I didn't cry. Not because it didn't move me, but because somehow I already knew. I walked to the hallway, pulled the brass key from the shoebox and closed my eyes around it. The lake house. I hadn't been in years. The last time, Michael was still in college. Rachel hadn't come. It rained the entire weekend, and Harold had read poetry by the fire while I made pancakes. I smiled. Later that day, I stood by the front steps to let in the breeze. Nora ran past me with a crayon in one hand and a flower in the other. Grandma, do you think this house remembers you? I turned. What? She looked at me, head tilted like a question too big for her. I mean, it feels like it knows you. I laughed, quietly, gently, then knelt beside her. Yes, sweetheart. Some homes. Remember. I didn't need to say the rest, because she already felt it. And maybe that was enough. Later that week, I would pack a bag, drive to the lake house, see what Harold had left for me. But for now, I let the wind shift the curtains, and I whispered into the quiet, if the walls remember us, then I'm never really gone. If you've ever stood in a home that held your story, you know what I mean. Thank you for sitting with mine. Let me know where you're watching from, and who still remembers your story.